Welcome everyone to Eurotech Reviews. On today's show we got a PC build under 1000 euros. I'm building this for a friend, so I used the Black Widow MS Industrial case. This case is a silent case and it's actually a copy of Fractal Designs cases. So this is a really good option if you're on a budget. The case itself, it's a blatant Chinese ripoff, but it actually works. So I have a similar case, which is a big tower, a Sama Big Fish. This is a mid tower. The packaging is good. The case arrived with no problem. You will see now, if you know Fractal Design, this will be really familiar to you. So the front grille, fan speed control, you can see two fans on the front, low nose fans, some sound insulation. On the top you have everything that you need on the front I/O, but there's no reset button for some reason. Then you have two shrouds that can be removed for ventilation on top, with a magnetic dust cover that goes on top, either that or those two plastic covers with sound insulation, depending on your preference. I didn't put the extra fans on. There's a third fan on the back. Now this is really nice. It's something that usually comes with only high-end cases, and if you have the top two or a radiator perhaps, top two fans, then this is really great for dust management. This is practically a standard case on the back. So we have a tray for dust for the PSU, and also it's a modern design as you shall see inside. Here we have a standard PSU shroud. So this is the sound insulation. It works quite well. The case is silent. We have cable management routing canals here. This is the top of the case with those plastic covers off. As you can see, you can mount 40mm radiator or fans on the top, but I chose not to because this build is not power hungry enough for that. We need a insulation, sound insulation more. This is a 3.5-inch base for hard drives. This is the place for the PSU, of course. And here we have the components that we'll put inside. So we have the AMD Ryzen 5 3600, which is a must-have for any build these days. Thermaltake Frio Silent 14 CPU cooler. I didn't go with the stock cooler because it's not really good or silent. The ASROCK Challenger 5600 XT from AMD. Vengeance low latency DDR4 RAMs, 2 sticks, 16 gigs on 3000 MHz. Samsung 1TB 860 QVO SSD, which is enough for games. A B450 Gaming X motherboard. We will touch on that later. And a Seasonic 80 plus gold 650 watt power supply, which is really important because my friend lives in the area where there's power outages and stuff. This is everything unpacked. Now you can see why I went with aftermarket cooler. The size difference, and of course everything that comes with that is more than obvious. The CPU itself. Here we have the graphics card, which is a standard dual fan graphics card, also quite quiet. The SSD, the RAM, the half modular semi-module power supply, and the motherboard itself. Moving on to the build itself, we're going to go to photos only because I didn't have the equipment to film everything. I will show you how to put everything together. First of all, this is of course the motherboard. First thing you'll have to do is mount the CPU. You will have to be careful to position the CPU the correct way. So you will see on the next picture, first of all you have to put up this little peg here, and of course you have to then position the CPU with a little triangle showing on the motherboard and the CPU itself in the same place. When it's mounted, it should look something like this. You have to be careful to make sure that every pin is in the right place. So the best thing is, before you clamp it down, to just like wiggle it a bit. I know it may sound kind of silly, but it's actually necessary, because if your CPU is not mounted correctly, then it can lead to system instabilities. I should note that you will have to discharge any static electricity that may be built on your hands by touching a radiator or something like that. Also use the motherboard box and the anti-static bag as your base. This is really important because static electricity can damage the motherboard or other components, and you really don't want to do that. Moving on to the RAM, here we have 2 sticks of DDR4 RAM. Now for mounting, if you want to get the most out of your RAM dual channel mode, then you will have to put it in this kind of configuration. Most of motherboards have 4 slots for RAM. When you're mounting the RAM, basically it's impossible to put it in backwards because of the pegs on the middle. This is how you put the RAM in. So you pressure it on both sides equally until it clicks in. So you will know when the levers on either side click in that your RAM is in and secure. Repeat that for the other stick and you're good to go. Next on, we will move to something that is most nerve-wracking for somebody who's building for the first time, and that's the mounting of the CPU cooler, especially if you're not using the stock cooler that came with your CPU. Most motherboards come with pre-installed fixed points for the stock cooler. I started removing here the components. As you can see, on one side you have the pre-installed stand, and on the other side I started to remove it. So first off, you will have to remove both sides of the cooler mounting bracket, and of course you will have to remove it on the other side of the motherboard. So the under tray, as you can see, this is from the under tray of the motherboard. This is what it looks like. You will have to mount the one that comes with the aftermarket cooler, which is this one. Now you will have to pay good attention to the user manual on how to mount it for a specific motherboard and cooler. The pegs on the outside, as you can see now, we mount the upper plate. We take some thermal paste, either which comes with the cooler or your own. You will have to remove the sticker, of course, from the cooler. Next up, we will have to put the thermal paste. Now I used my own thermal paste, but you can use that which comes with the cooler. The trick is to put a small amount but evenly spread across the CPU. It should look something like this when it's finished. Be careful not to overdo it. Too much thermal paste does nothing, it hampers actually the cooling process. So it has to be a thin layer, but all across the CPU. You don't have to do it perfectly. When you mount the cooler, the pressure itself will take care of any imperfections. Once mounted, it should look something like this. Now, I cannot stress this enough. You have to pay good attention to the user manual for mounting the cooler. Most coolers are designed for multiple sockets, multiple motherboards, so you have to be careful to read the instruction manual for the motherboard or the socket that you need. Now, all mounted, it should look something like this. You will have to secure the mounting bracket and the cooler really tight by slowly screwing in equally on all sides until you get to the point where it's really hard to screw in. You don't have to like manically screw in anything because you can damage the board, of course. This is the mounted radiator. Next up, you plug in your CPU fan and mount it on the cooler. Consult your motherboard user manual to see where it plugs in. Next up, we will test fit the motherboard into the case. Most cases have pre-installed washers or risers for the motherboard. These are the golden pins that you see. Make sure that you put the right amount and in the right place for your motherboard, so to ensure the stability of your motherboard and the components on it, and not to put undue stress to the motherboard. Also, make sure to remove any protective covering from your case before mounting the motherboard. Once fitted, it should look something like this. Also, make sure that your fans are all blowing in the same direction. As you can see here, when you mount the fan, it has little indicators that show you your airflow or the direction of the airflow, and make sure that it's not contradicting the other fans in the case, so you have maximum airflow and minimal dust. If you have a DVD or a Blu-ray burner, then you have to remove the front panel and make sure to have enough bolts to secure it in place. Next up, we have something that is the most tedious thing to do in these builds, and it's one of the most confusing things for somebody who's building a PC for the first time, and that is plugging all the input-output from the motherboard to your case and to everything else. For this, you just have to have patience, and you have to read the instruction manuals to the T. So your best friend here is patience and your motherboard user manual. In 99.9% you won't have to plug in everything, so it's normal that half of these jacks remained unplugged. Next up, it's cable management. Now, this is not only an aesthetic thing, but it's also an airflow thing. So the better your cable management is, the less clutter you have on the inside of your case, and of course that means a cooler GPU, a cooler CPU, and less noise overall. Use the back portion of the case. Most modern cases have enough room and as you can see, like ports for cable management. This you will have to learn on your own, so basically the best thing is that on the front of the case, on the inside, you have the minimum amount of exposed cables, and on the back you can clean it up using zip ties and everything else. Now this part I cannot show you exactly how to do it because it depends on your case, on your motherboard, on your components, and on your PSU or your power supply. The one thing that I will tell you, that if you have a power supply shroud like this has, then you should mount your power supply last. This only applies to modular and semi-modular power supplies, because usually you don't have to use the whole array on your power supply. But if you mount the power supply beforehand, you will have a hard time plugging in anything else to the power supply because of the power supply shroud. So first of all, you plug in from your power supply to your motherboard, the main power supply. Then you will have to put the A pin for your CPU, which is basically right next to your CPU. Of course, plug in your SSDs or hard drives or whatnot. This is the best way to avoid any entanglement of the cables and everything else. And after you mounted everything, then you will mount the GPU. So the GPU is mounted on the X16 PCI Express port. Consult your motherboard to user manual to see where it is. And lastly, don't forget to put in the 6 or 8 pin additional power supply for your CPU. In the end, it should look something like this. Sorry for the low light quality, but I had to finish this build really quickly. This is also the reason why I didn't do any benchmarks, but then again, there's plenty of those on the internet. Here is the finished build next to my current setup. As you can see, they are really similar in design. And now we're going to boot it up for the first time. The thing to note here, if you're building your first PC, when you turn it off for the first time, it will take a while to boot. So this is quite normal. As you shall see now, it takes quite a while to boot up into BIOS or whatever. So it's don't freak out immediately if your computer doesn't turn on, and don't turn it off. So you will see now that it takes some time. Even I was kind of skeptical about maybe not doing something properly, but if you wait long enough, it will post. If you want to be sure, you can put on a PC speaker, which comes with the motherboard or with the case, and then you can listen to the signals. If there's something wrong, it will beep in certain ways, or more expensive motherboards actually have a display that displays any errors. Don't close the case before the first successful post. Once you're in the BIOS, you should turn on your XMP profile for your RAM. That's the first thing you should do, and also you can see tutorials for your specific motherboard on how to set up everything correctly. Usually the RAM is the biggest problem because it comes with a lower clock out of the box. For everything else, you can see tutorials or user manual on your motherboard. And now I'm going to go on a mini AMD rant. So AMD, what are you doing with your software? It's always some kind of problems. I had this problem with this rig as well as mine. I mean, AMD BIOS updates, drivers, problem with drivers, with compatibility issues, with everything else. Long term, I recommend AMD always, because it's just better value for your money, and eventually, you know, long term the kinks in the software and the BIOS get flushed out and everything works fine. But holy crap, I mean, this build as well, I had to update the BIOS for the motherboard. I had crashes with Windows installation. I had to update the BIOS on the graphics card just to make everything work properly. This should not happen. I mean, every time there's a problem with the drivers or with the BIOS or with something else. AMD, please hire somebody. I mean, hire people that know what they're doing with the software. This is why AMD gets a bad rap, because there's always on launch date and sometimes afterwards there's always stability issues, driver issues, and I mean, for enthusiasts it's fine, you know, you will always get a workaround and everything else, but for like normal users, it's just frustrating, and you think you got some bad hardware when the hardware is fine. I mean, it's top notch, but the software, there's always some kind of problem, always. Would I still recommend AMD? Absolutely, every time. I mean, software problems aside, especially if you're not going to upgrade your PC every year or 2 years, it's definitely long-term far better hardware
than the competition. If you have any questions or you need help with your build, please leave the questions in the comments and I will try to answer them all. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please like, comment and subscribe. It would really mean a lot to me. Until next time, this is Eurotech Reviews signing out.